The battle for control of Ukraine's Donbas region shows few signs of abating, and the city of Pokrovsk has emerged as a focal point for this protracted conflict. Russian forces claim they are advancing in and around Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast, a key logistics and supply hub location. According to a Reuters report, Russia says its forces advance in ruins of Pokrovsk. Ukraine says defenders hold on. Meanwhile, Ukraine has responded by deploying special operations units to bolster defences in the city. The Ukrainian military also states it has stopped a recent Russian push north of the city. Pokrovsk is regarded as strategically critical because of its role as a supply corridor for Ukrainian forces. Losing it would provide Moscow with both territorial and symbolic gains in the Donbas. On Kyiv's side, Commander-in-Chief Syrskyi has emphasized that Ukrainian forces are reinforcing logistics and assault groups to push the enemy out of the urban area around Pokrovsk. In the broader context, the war now enters its fourth year with continued high intensity. Observers cite that the front lines remain largely static, yet Russia is mounting incremental advances, especially in Donetsk. A report from August 2025 noted that Moscow captured roughly 17 kilometers of frontline territory in the Donetsk region, signaling a shift from earlier patterns of stalemate. The developments mirror many of the dynamics described in your transcript. Russian forces claiming encirclement, Ukrainian denials, talk of supply line severing, and fierce fighting for key cities. In earlier years of the war, the town of Popasna in Luhansk Oblast became a symbol of devastation and the attritional nature of the conflict. Russian forces seized it in 2022, and large parts of the town remain destroyed. Now, the focus has shifted further west and south into Donetsk, especially areas like Pokrovsk, Dobropilya and other sub-regions where supply routes and transport corridors are vital. The current push underlines Russia's effort not just to capture territory, but to undermine Ukraine's ability to sustain operations. From Ukraine's perspective, retreating from key positions to preserve manpower is now emerging as a pragmatic choice, contrasting with earlier phases of the war. General Syrsky's approach reflects this adaptation. Turning to the case of Goli Kouhkan, her situation has triggered fresh international attention to the plight of child brides, the rights of women and ethnic minorities, and Iran's judicial system. Kouhkan was married at age 12 to her cousin, became pregnant at 13, and later faced life on death row for the 2018 killing of her husband amid allegations of long-term abuse. She was arrested at 18 and accused of signing a confession while illiterate and without a lawyer, was sentenced under Iran's Qisas law, which permits the family of a murder victim to accept blood money instead of execution. As of November 2025, she must raise approximately US $105,000 by December to secure a pardon. Rights groups say the case reflects systemic discrimination. Kouhkan is Baluch from one of Iran's most marginalized communities, and this underscores how gender, ethnicity and poverty intersect in the Iranian legal and social system. Her case is one of multiple recent executions of women in Iran, at least 30 inches 2025. So far, many linked to abusive marriages or child bride situations. Below is a rewritten narrative in newsroom tone, preserving important direct quotes verbatim and attributing them clearly. The war in eastern Ukraine has entered yet another pivotal phase as Moscow's forces press hard for a breakthrough in the Donetsk region. In recent days, Kremlin-backed units have claimed to have struck Ukrainian positions and launched advances around the city of Pokrovsk, a strategic logistics hub in western Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian authorities, for their part, deny key Russian assertions and insist their forces remain firmly engaged. Russian military statements say their units have launched offensives against the Ukrainian forces from multiple regions in the direction of Pokrovsk as they try to sever supply corridors and encircle the city. In a statement released through the Russian Ministry of Defense, troops are reported to have surrounded Ukrainian personnel in the town, a claim Kyiv continues to reject. Ukrainian Commander-in-Chief General Oleksandr Syrskyi told reporters that despite the severity of the situation, the city has not been surrounded or blockaded by the Russian forces, and that Ukrainian troops continue to hold their positions and carry out comprehensive operations. Ukrainian accounts go further. A number of assault units are being deployed or reinforced in the area. And in some districts, Ukraine says it has improved its tactical posture. The significance of Pokrovsk cannot be overstated, known as a critical supply corridor for Ukrainian forces. Defending the Donbas, its capture would yield one of Russia's most substantial territorial gains in the conflict since 2024. Moscow has long declared its aim to take the entirety of the Donbas, including both Luhansk and Donetsk Oblast. Ukraine currently retains only a small portion of Donetsk, roughly 5,000 square kilometers, equal to about 10% of the region. While Ukraine maintains much of the front remains stable, recent data underscore the mounting pressure. October witnessed a surge in Russian missile and drone strikes on Ukraine's energy grid, the highest monthly count since Kyiv began publishing such figures in early 2023. Russian authorities claim the offensive is making steady gains. Kyiv counters that the battle remains costly and gains marginal. For Ukraine, the key is whether its defensive lines can hold against this renewed push and whether supply lines can be maintained. In the Donetsk corridor, analysts are now warning of the prospect that Russian forces may succeed in cutting off Ukrainian logistics altogether, potentially forcing a retreat or a collapse of defenses. Ukrainian military sources confirm that special operations formations have been sent to reinforce Pokrovsk and that the battle has entered a delicate and dangerous phase. Against this backdrop of high-stakes military confrontation, the fate of the Eastern Front may hinge less on dramatic breakthroughs than on which side can sustain its resources, retain morale and protect its supply chains. Ukraine's leadership has signalled that the aim is not only to survive, but to preserve its forces for future operations, a departure in tone from the all-out counteroffensives of past years. Meanwhile, in Iran, the story of one young woman has come to symbolize profound structural issues in the country's justice system, gender relations and ethnic minority rights. Goli Kouhkan, a 5-year-old from the Baluch minority, sits on death row in Gorgan Central Prison. She was married at age 12 to her cousin, bore a child at 13, and was arrested at 18 after a violent incident in which her husband died. Under Iran's Qisas law, she was sentenced to death unless she pays the victim's family approximately 10 billion tomans before a December deadline. Her case has reignited global outrage. Human rights organizations describe her situation as emblematic of systemic discrimination faced by women and ethnic minorities in Iran, particularly those married as children. She is probably the absolute weakest in Iranian society, said one rights advocate. The verdict also coincides with an alarming spike in female executions in Iran, at least 30 so far this year, many of them linked to abusive marriages and child bride status. Kouhkan's story joins previous cases such as Samira Sabzian-Fard and Fatima Salbehi, where child brides were executed after long periods of abuse and legal neglect. The emerging pattern, rights groups say, reveals a brutal poverty, child marriage, domestic violence, and a justice system that punishes the victims when they fight back. In Iran's tilted legal framework, where it remains legal to marry at 12 and legal representation is minimal in many cases, Kouhkan's plight is far from isolated. Her ability to pay the demanded sum and thereby secure a pardon is vanishingly small. If she fails, she will face execution by hanging, the ultimate outcome of a system that rights defenders say is built on fear and discrimination. Halfway across the globe, the United States is in the midst of both a political and legal tipping point. President Donald J. Trump is facing a multi-front test. Electoral contests in key states are being cast as referendum on his agenda. At the same time, the U.S. Supreme Court is about to weigh whether the executive branch exceeded its constitutional authority in imposing sweeping global tariffs. In recent remarks, President Trump said, "We've had success like nobody, but for some reason you lose the midterms. His statement underscores the urgency with which he and his allies view the upcoming electoral fights. Trump is warning Republicans that losing now could mean the radical left takes over or at least takes away his agenda. The stakes extend far beyond individual governorships and mayoral offices. The results are likely to be read as a barometer of Trump's continuing political capital heading into the 2026 midterms. From the White House side, the strategy has included selective intervention in state races, financial backing, endorsements, last-minute rallies, and the framing of those races as a battle for survival of the agenda. For the opposition, the message is no less clear. Blowout or close losses in key states could indicate serious headwinds for the president. But the test isn't only electoral. On the legal track, the Supreme Court will soon hear arguments in the case Learning Resources Incorporated v. Trump, which asks whether the president may rely on the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act to impose broad import taxes, tariffs without explicit congressional authorization. Critics argue that tariffs are essentially taxes and that the Constitution vests the power to tax and regulate trade in Congress. The administration contends the tariffs were justified by national security concerns and trade imbalance. If the court rules against the president, the implications would reach far beyond any single industry. One legal memo warned that invalidating the tariffs could force the U.S. to refund up to $1 trillion in duties collected since the policy began. President Trump announced he will not attend the oral arguments, explaining, "I wanted to go so badly, I just don't want to do anything to deflect the importance of that decision." It's not about me, it's about our country. Analysts note that the case is as much about executive power and constitutional limits as it is about trade. The major questions doctrine, non-delegation issues and the separation of powers are all at play. If the court curtails the president's ability to act unilaterally in trade policy, it could reshape the balance of power between the White House and Congress. It is this multivalent struggle, state-level votes, presidential influence, judicial limits that may determine not only the next chapter of the president's agenda, but also the broader trajectory of American governance. The convergence of electoral and judicial tests makes the coming weeks one of the most consequential periods in U.S. politics in recent memory. At the global level, the stories underscore three interconnected themes: the endurance of high-intensity warfare, the fragility of human rights protections, and the contested nature of executive power in democratic systems. In Ukraine, the fight around Pokrovsk and Donetsk is not just territorial, it is logistical, existential, and symbolic. Holding or losing supply corridors can decide battles, armies, and even national survival. Ukraine is attempting to hold the line while rethinking strategies. Russia is shifting from attrition to incremental capture. The future of the Eastern Front may hinge less on grand offensives than on whether Ukraine can sustain, reinforce, and supply its defenses. In Iran, the plight of Goli Kouhkan is tragic on an individual level, but even more instructive as a warning sign of systemic abuse. Her story reveals how gender, ethnicity, poverty, and legal structure combine to trap the most vulnerable. International concern is high precisely because her situation is not exceptional. It is emblematic of broader injustices. In the United States, the concurrent legal and electoral tests reflect how domestic governance issues increasingly have global ripple effects. Whether a president can impose tariffs unilaterally, whether state races serve as barometers for national power, and whether the judiciary can rein in executive overreach, all speak to the durability of democratic checks and balances. From the battlefields of eastern Ukraine to the crowded courtrooms in Washington and the prisons of Iran, power is being tested in every direction: military, legal, political, and human rights-based. The city of Pokrovsk stands as a flashpoint for a war that many hoped would end quicker. Goli Kouhkan stands as a symbol of how vulnerability and powerlessness persist under certain legal systems. And in the US, the Supreme Court's decision on tariffs may well redefine the scope of presidential authority for generations to come. One thing is clear: history is not waiting. The outcomes of these struggles on the ground in Ukraine, in the Iranian justice system, and within the US constitutional framework will reverberate far beyond the immediate headlines.